Hey gang, last week we were using a viewfinder to help us find the negative shapes, which is the beginning of a form of mapping. And we make sure we draw the border, we acknowledge that border, and then begin to put that on the paper and divide that space into smaller bits. First doing a negative shape down one side and the other, on the right and the left, and then to take that central positive shape and divide it up, showing the negative spaces in it as well. Then using the trowel and then using some other doing some other divisions of just the big shape, we now have the majority of the shapes. And you'll notice on the trowel I've actually begun to divide the positive shape into its various parts, which is the beginning of what we would call diagramming. So we're going to use the exact same process when we use a photograph, which makes it a little easier to work. Do the outside border and then begin to break apart the inside of that border with negative shapes, then divide the negative shapes into smaller pieces.
Heavy. Any shape that you see or any edges of shapes that you see, you can certainly trace around them. Try to divide the space into those. Because if you were then coming back afterwards and putting contour line, nice contour lines or shading, you now know where those things are going. This is all about, in this particular process, what we're doing is we're not so much drawing from an object. We are trying to get the idea though of tracing the lines we see, that particularly the ones that divide the shapes. The big shape, the big solid shape, and the negative space. And basically those lines we're getting those to create a division of the interior shape. And it's okay sometimes when you're doing this that you're sort of making marks where you're going, like sort of marks where you know where you're going to go next, and you're sort of predetermining what you're going to draw, where you're going to draw from one spot to the next. Divide it up into a set of a part of an image that lets you know where other things will go. You have edges of darks, edges of lights, and other details.
The stuff behind it distracts.
Most of us get pretty good at that, blocking out everything else.
So are you drawing, like, when you do this, are you...
So it's all, remember, the big thing is to get the big shapes behind the negative spaces first. You've gotten are correct. Getting the big background shapes correct before we move into detail, before we start moving into anything else.
Still think I missed it.
In the second half of the class last week, we began to move into a different way of working, a very different way of working, but it still involves both using positive shapes and negative shapes, interior and exterior silhouettes, using a masking technique. Instead of doing lines as much, it's more about doing things that create mass and eventually will create volume and darks and lights for us. See you next week, guys.